One Bastion P launcher, two Onyx supersonic anti-ship missiles loaded and ready, a reload vehicle parked 40 meters away, a mobile command post with 6 operators inside. Total estimated value, over $120 million. Destroyed in under 90 seconds. March 4th, 2026. Crimea's western coastline. A Russian K-300P Bastion P coastal defense battery, the single most important anti-ship asset Russia had deployed along this sector, sat exposed at a forward staging area. Its radar was powered down. Its crew was running maintenance checks. Its air defense umbrella had just been pulled 12 kilometers to the east by something the Russians didn't understand yet. By the time they figured it out, the launcher was burning. I'm your host at Warfist TV, where we analyze the battles that change wars. And today, we're breaking down one of the most consequential precision strikes of the entire Black Sea campaign. Because this wasn't just a missile launcher being destroyed. This was the moment Ukraine cracked open Crimea's coastal shield and changed the geometry of naval warfare in the region for months to come. Let's start from the beginning. To understand why this single strike mattered so much, you need to understand what the Bastion P actually does. The K-300P Bastion P is Russia's premier mobile coastal defense missile system. It fires the P-800 Onyx, a supersonic anti-ship cruise missile that travels at speeds exceeding Mach 2.5. That's roughly 3,000 kilometers per hour. At sea-skimming altitude, an Onyx missile covers the distance from launch to a target 300 kilometers away in under 6 minutes. There is no warning. There is no time to react. A ship's radar picks up the incoming missile perhaps 15 seconds before impact. At Mach 2.5, 15 seconds means the missile is already 7 kilometers away and closing. Most point defense systems get one shot, maybe two. Against a missile performing terminal evasive maneuvers at supersonic speed, that's often not enough. Russia had positioned multiple Bastion batteries across Crimea since 2014. Their purpose was singular and absolute: deny the Black Sea to any vessel that Moscow did not approve of. Ukrainian naval drones, NATO reconnaissance ships, commercial traffic routes, all of it fell within the Bastion's engagement envelope. A single launcher carrying 2 Onyx missiles could threaten an area of over 200,000 square kilometers of open water. Which weapon posed the greatest threat to Ukrainian naval operations? A. The Bastion's Onyx missiles. B. Russian naval mines. C. Caliber cruise missiles from frigates. Drop your answer in the comments below. For Ukraine, the Bastion problem was existential. Throughout 2024 and into 2025, Ukrainian forces had achieved extraordinary success with naval drone operations. Unmanned surface vessels, essentially explosive-laden speedboats, guided by operators hundreds of kilometers away, had sunk or damaged over a dozen Russian warships. The flagship Moskva, patrol boats, landing ships, a Rapucha-class vessel hid in port. The Ukrainian Navy, which had no traditional warships to speak of, was winning the Black Sea through sheer innovation. But the Bastion was the ceiling. Ukrainian naval drone operators knew that pushing too close to Crimea's western shores meant entering the Onyx engagement zone. A drone boat traveling at 40 knots is a slow, fat target for a missile traveling at Mach 2.5. Russia didn't even need to hit the drone directly. The Onyx warhead carries 300 kilograms of high explosive, and its proximity fuse detonates within lethal radius of any small vessel on the surface. So the drones stayed back. They operated in windows. They picked off targets that strayed too far from Crimea's protective umbrella. But the western approach, the corridor that would allow Ukrainian assets to threaten Sevastopol's outer anchorage and the Russian logistics routes running along Crimea's coast, remained locked down. The Bastion was the lock. Ukraine needed to find the key. That process began in late November 2025. Ukrainian military intelligence, the GUR, had been tracking Bastion movements across Crimea for months using a combination of satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and a network of partisan informants still operating inside occupied territory. The challenge was immense. The Bastion P system is mobile. The entire battery, launcher, reload vehicle, command post, radar can pack up and relocate within 15 minutes. Russia moved its Bastion units frequently, rarely staying in one position for more than 48 hours. But patterns emerge. They always do. Stay with me, because what Ukrainian intelligence pieced together over the next 3 months led to one of the most precisely executed strikes of this war. GUR analysts noticed that one particular Bastion battery, designated by Ukrainian planners as Target Foxtrot 7, followed a predictable rotation between 3 positions along Crimea's western coast. The battery would deploy to a clifftop position overlooking the sea for active duty, then rotate back to one of 2 staging areas for maintenance and crew rotation. The active positions were heavily defended. Russian Pantsir S-1 short-range air defense systems, electronic warfare units, and infantry security cordons made a strike during deployment nearly impossible. The staging areas were different. One staging area, located roughly 11 kilometers inland from the coast, near a Soviet-era military repair depot, had notably thinner air defense coverage. The nearest Pantsir system was positioned 4 kilometers to the northeast, oriented to cover the active deployment site rather than the rear area. A Buk M3 medium-range air defense battery sat further to the east, roughly 19 kilometers away, but its radar coverage of the staging area was partially blocked by terrain. Ukrainian signals intelligence confirmed something critical in late January 2026. Each time the Bastion battery rotated to this staging area, its engagement radar, the Monolith B, was powered down for maintenance. Without the Monolith B active, the battery was blind. It could not detect incoming threats. It could not launch. It was, for a brief window, just a collection of very expensive vehicles parked in the open. The window was narrow. Maintenance cycles lasted between 6 and 10 hours. The battery was at this particular staging area roughly once every 9 to 12 days. Ukrainian planners needed to catch the battery during maintenance, confirm the radar was down, and execute a strike before Russian air defenses could react. They began rehearsing in early February. Strike planners at a Ukrainian command center, location classified, ran simulations using satellite terrain data and known Russian air defense positions. The attack geometry was complicated. The staging area sat in a shallow valley, which meant any munition coming in on a direct trajectory from Ukrainian-held territory would need to overfly at least 2 known Russian radar positions. Detection was almost certain. Interception was probable, so they designed a different approach. The plan had 3 phases. Phase 1. Deception. A swarm of between 15 and 20 decoy drones, cheap, commercially modified quadcopters, and fixed-wing UAVs equipped with radar reflectors would approach Crimea from the northeast. These drones were not meant to strike anything. They were meant to die. Their job was to saturate Russian air defense radars along the eastern approach corridor, triggering alarms and pulling operator attention toward a perceived mass drone attack from the direction of mainland Ukraine. Phase 2. Suppression. While Russian radar operators scrambled to track and engage the decoy swarm, Ukrainian electronic warfare assets would activate jamming on specific frequencies used by the Buk M3 battery's target acquisition radar. The jamming wouldn't be total. That would alert the Russians to an electronic attack and trigger backup protocols. Instead, Ukrainian EW operators would introduce intermittent interference, degrading the Buk's ability to track fast-moving targets at medium altitude without making it obvious that jamming was occurring. Phase 3. The kill shot. Long-range precision munitions. Ukrainian planners selected a combination of domestically produced cruise missiles and a Western-supplied standoff weapon, the specific type of which remains classified in official reports, but which OSINT analysts have assessed as likely being a Storm Shadow variant, would approach the staging area from the west, flying a circuitous route over the Black Sea at low altitude to avoid detection until the terminal phase. The timing had to be perfect. The decoy swarm needed to reach Russian radar detection range approximately 4 minutes before the strike munitions entered their terminal approach. Too early, and the Russians would resolve the decoy threat and reorient before the real strike arrived. Too late, and the munitions would be flying into an alert and fully active air defense network. Ukrainian planners calculated and recalculated the sequence. They had 1 shot. If the strike failed, Russia would relocate the Bastion battery immediately and likely increase air defense coverage at all staging areas. The intelligence advantage would be gone. On March 3, 2026, satellite imagery confirmed that Target Foxtrot 7 had rotated back to the staging area. The Bastion launcher, its reload vehicle, and the mobile command post were all visible in imagery taken at 2:14 p.m. local time. Signals intelligence detected no emissions from the Monolith B radar. The battery was in maintenance mode. The window was open. Ukrainian commanders authorized the strike for the early morning hours of March 4th. 0 hour was set for 4:08 a.m. local time, chosen because satellite pass schedules indicated a gap in Russian space-based surveillance, and because pre-dawn darkness would complicate visual acquisition by any Russian air defense operators who switched to optical tracking. At 3:51 a.m., the decoy drone swarm launched from positions in southern Ukraine. 17 drones, a mix of modified Mugen 5 fixed-wing airframes and DJI Matrice platforms carrying corner reflectors, climbed to altitudes between 200 and 600 meters and began flying southwest toward Crimea at speeds between 80 and 130 kilometers per hour. Their radar signatures were deliberately inconsistent. Some reflectors were calibrated to mimic the radar cross-section of larger attack drones. Others produced signatures consistent with cruise missiles. The goal was confusion. At 4:02 a.m., Russian radar stations along Crimea's northeastern perimeter began detecting the swarm. Within 60 seconds, multiple air defense units went to high alert. Intercepted communications, later confirmed by Ukrainian intelligence, showed radar operators reporting an incoming mass drone attack from the northeast. A Panzer S-1 battery near Yevpatoria began tracking targets. The Buk M3 battery, the one whose radar coverage partially reached the Bastion staging area, swung its acquisition radar to the northeast and began attempting to lock individual targets in the swarm. The trap was set. How many Russian air defense assets were diverted by the Ukrainian decoy swarm? A. 2 systems. B. 4 systems. C. 6 or more systems. The answer comes at the end of the video. At 4:04 a.m., Ukrainian electronic warfare units activated targeted jamming against the Buk M3's acquisition radar frequency. The jamming was subtle, intermittent bursts that created ghost returns and degraded tracking accuracy without triggering a complete signal loss alarm. The Buk operators already focused on the drone swarm to the northeast, attributed the interference to the sheer number of targets cluttering their screens. They didn't look west. That was the mistake that cost Russia its coastal defense. At 4:06 a.m., the strike munitions, which had launched from Ukrainian-controlled territory approximately 40 minutes earlier and had been flying a long, circuitous route over the Black Sea at altitudes below 50 meters, began their terminal approach. The munitions popped up briefly to acquire final targeting coordinates using onboard guidance systems, then dove back to low altitude for the final run. The staging area was 11 kilometers inland. The munitions crossed the coastline at 4:07 a.m., traveling at high subsonic speed. Russian coastal observation posts did not detect the crossing. The Panzer S-1 battery 4 kilometers northeast of the staging area had its radar oriented to the northeast, tracking decoy drones. Its operators never rotated the array. Subscribe to Warfist TV if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because this is the level of detail that changes how you see every headline about this war. At 4:08 a.m., the first munition struck. It hit the Bastion P transporter erector launcher dead center. The warhead, a high-explosive penetrator designed to defeat hardened targets, detonated on the launcher's upper deck, directly between the 2 Onyx missile canisters. The explosion was catastrophic. The Onyx missile's solid-fuel rocket boosters ignited instantly, creating a secondary detonation that sent a fireball climbing over 200 meters into the night sky. The launcher, a vehicle weighing over 40 tons when fully loaded, was torn apart. Fragments scattered across a radius of nearly 150 meters. 7 seconds later, the second munition arrived. This one struck the reload vehicle, a modified MAZ-7930 8-wheeled transporter carrying 2 additional Onyx missiles in their canisters. The warhead penetrated the vehicle's upper structure and detonated inside the missile storage compartment. The resulting explosion was even larger than the first. 2 fully fueled Onyx missiles, each carrying 300 kilograms of warhead explosive and several hundred kilograms of solid rocket fuel, detonated simultaneously. The blast wave flattened a prefabricated maintenance shelter 20 meters away and overturned a Ural 4320 logistics truck parked nearby. The command post was next. Approximately 12 seconds after the second impact, a third munition, traveling on a slightly different approach vector, struck the mobile command vehicle. This was a modified Kamaz truck housing the Bastion battery's fire control systems, communications equipment, and crew workspace. At the time of impact, Ukrainian intelligence estimates that between 4 and 6 crew members were inside. The vehicle was destroyed completely. Post-strike satellite imagery showed nothing remaining but a blackened crater and scattered debris. 90 seconds. 3 impacts. The entire Bastion P battery, launcher, reload vehicle, command post ceased to exist. Drone footage captured by a Ukrainian reconnaissance UAV orbiting at high altitude showed the staging area engulfed in flames. Secondary explosions continued for over 7 minutes as missile fuel and ammunition cooked off. The fire was visible from the nearest civilian settlement, over 8 kilometers away. Russian emergency response vehicles began arriving at the site approximately 22 minutes after the strike, but there was nothing to salvage. Let me break down the damage assessment. The Bastion P transporter erector launcher destroyed. Estimated replacement cost, including the 2 loaded Onyx missiles, approximately $45 million. The reload vehicle with 2 additional Onyx missiles destroyed. Estimated cost, approximately $38 million. The mobile command post with fire control systems and communications destroyed. Estimated cost, approximately $15 million. Maintenance equipment, a logistics truck, and a prefabricated shelter destroyed. Estimated cost, approximately $4 million. Personnel casualties, Ukrainian intelligence estimates between 8 and 12 Russian service members were eliminated in the strike, including at least 2 officers from the Coastal Defense Missile Brigade. Total estimated material loss, over $100 million in equipment destroyed in 90 seconds, but the material cost was almost secondary. The strategic impact was what mattered. Within hours of the strike, the consequences began cascading through Russia's Black Sea defensive posture. The destruction of target Foxtrot 7 created what military planners call a coverage gap, a sector of Crimea's western coastline that was no longer protected by anti-ship missile systems. The nearest remaining Bastion battery was positioned to cover the southwestern approach to Sevastopol, but its engagement envelope did not extend far enough north to cover the sector that Foxtrot 7 had been protecting. Ukrainian naval planners had mapped this vulnerability in advance. They knew exactly which corridor would open if Foxtrot 7 was destroyed, and they were ready to exploit it. Within 36 hours of the strike, Ukrainian naval drone units pushed unmanned surface vessels into waters that had been inaccessible for months. Drone boat patrols moved to within 40 nautical miles of Crimea's western shore, closer than any Ukrainian naval asset had operated since the early months of the war. Russian naval traffic along the western Crimean coast, which had been flowing relatively freely under the Bastion's protective umbrella, suddenly became vulnerable. If you believe tactics win wars, type Warfist TV in the comments, because what you're watching right now is proof. Intercepted Russian communications from the hours following the strike painted a picture of command paralysis. A coastal defense commander, believed to be a colonel, was recorded telling his superior that the destruction of the Bastion battery had created an indefensible corridor along the western coast. He requested immediate redeployment of air defense assets to cover the remaining Bastion positions, warning that Ukrainian forces would certainly attempt to replicate the strike. He was right to be worried. The Russian response was reactive and chaotic. Within 48 hours, 2 Panzer S-1 systems were redeployed from positions near Simferopol to reinforce air defense coverage around the remaining Bastion batteries. A Buk M2 battery was moved from the eastern part of the peninsula to plug the gap in medium-range air defense coverage. But these redeployments weakened Russian air defense in other sectors, a fact that Ukrainian planners immediately noted and began to exploit for subsequent operations. This is the cascading logic of precision strike warfare. You don't just destroy a target, you force the enemy to react, and every reaction creates a new vulnerability. Ukraine hit 1 Bastion battery and forced Russia to reorganize its entire Crimean air defense network. Each redeployment created movement, and movement creates signatures that Ukrainian intelligence can detect, track, and target. The GUR's intelligence preparation for this strike deserves particular recognition. The 3-month surveillance operation that identified the Bastion battery's rotation pattern, the staging area's air defense weaknesses, and the maintenance schedule was a masterclass in intelligence-driven targeting. This was not a lucky shot. This was the product of patient, methodical collection and analysis by intelligence professionals who understood that finding the right moment to strike was more important than having the most powerful weapon. And the deception plan was equally impressive. The decoy drone swarm, 17 cheap, expendable aircraft costing perhaps $30,000 in total, successfully diverted an entire sector of Russian air defense. Pantsir S-1 missiles, which cost approximately $60,000 to $100,000 each, were fired at decoy drones worth a few $100s apiece. The Buk M3 battery wasted critical minutes tracking false targets while the real threat approached from the opposite direction. This is the asymmetry that defines Ukrainian military innovation. Ukraine cannot match Russia in total firepower. It cannot produce missiles and launchers at the rate Russia can. But it can think faster, it can plan more creatively, and it can exploit the rigidity of Russian command structures that respond slowly to unexpected threats. The crew members operating the decoy drones, flying their cheap aircraft into the teeth of Russian air defenses, knowing that every drone would be shot down, but that their sacrifice would create the window Ukraine needed, exemplify the courage and ingenuity that has defined the Ukrainian military throughout this war. They launched from exposed forward positions in southern Ukraine, knowing that Russian counter-battery radar might detect their positions. They flew their missions. Every single decoy drone was destroyed, and every single one did its job. The electronic warfare operators deserve equal credit. The targeted jamming of the Buk M3 radar required precise knowledge of the system's operating frequencies and the skill to degrade its performance without triggering alarms. This is not simply a matter of pressing a button. EW warfare at this level requires trained operators making real-time adjustments, monitoring enemy radar emissions, and calibrating interference to stay just below the threshold of detection. Ukrainian EW capabilities have improved dramatically since 2022, supported by Western training programs and technology transfers, and this strike demonstrated that those investments are paying dividends. What would NATO have done differently in planning this strike? How would a NATO combined arms approach have differed from Ukraine's solution? Drop your analysis in the comments. Now, let's talk about the broader strategic implications. The destruction of the Bastion battery accelerated a trend that has been building in the Black Sea theater throughout late 2025 and early 2026. Russia's naval dominance, once considered absolute, has been systematically dismantled by Ukrainian innovation. The sinking and damaging of over a dozen warships by naval drones forced the Russian Black Sea Fleet to retreat from its forward operating areas near Crimea's western coast. The destruction of Bastion batteries removes the next layer of Russian naval defense, the shore-based missile systems that were supposed to compensate for the fleet's withdrawal. Without both warships and coastal defense missiles to control the western approaches to Crimea, Russia faces a growing vulnerability. Ukrainian naval drones can now operate in areas that were previously death zones. Supply routes along Crimea's western coast, used to transport ammunition, fuel, and equipment to Russian forces on the peninsula, are increasingly exposed to interdiction. Ukrainian General Staff reports from the week following the strike indicated that Russian naval logistics convoys along the western Crimean coast reduced their frequency by approximately 40%. Ships that had previously traveled relatively close to shore, relying on the Bastion's protective umbrella, began routing further south, adding hours to transit times and increasing fuel consumption. Some convoys reportedly requested naval escorts, pulling Russian patrol vessels away from other duties. The ripple effects extended beyond naval operations. Russian air defense reorganization across Crimea, forced by the need to protect remaining Bastion positions, created temporary gaps that Ukrainian air forces exploited for several subsequent strikes on other targets in the following weeks. The details of those operations remain partially classified, but Ukrainian sources confirmed that the Bastion strike's cascading effects contributed to at least 3 additional successful engagements against Russian military infrastructure on the peninsula. This is the lesson that military academies will study for decades. A single precision strike, enabled by months of intelligence work and executed through creative deception, didn't just destroy one weapon system. It unraveled an entire defensive network. It forced the enemy into reactive redeployments that created new vulnerabilities, and it opened operational corridors that changed the balance of power across an entire theater of operations. The cost-exchange ratio tells the story in numbers. Ukraine expended strike munitions and decoy drones worth, by most estimates, between $8 and $15 million. Russia lost over $100 million in equipment, suffered personnel casualties, was forced to reorganize its air defense network across an entire peninsula, lost control of a critical naval corridor, and saw its logistics routes disrupted for weeks. That is a ratio that Ukraine can sustain, and it is a ratio that Russia cannot afford to absorb repeatedly. The Bastion strike also reinforced a doctrinal shift that has been emerging throughout this conflict. The traditional model of naval warfare, fleets of warships projecting power through their physical presence, is giving way to a distributed model where precision strike systems, unmanned vehicles, and shore-based intelligence networks can control maritime space without ever putting a crewed vessel at risk. Ukraine, a country that lost most of its navy in the first days of the 2022 invasion, now exercises meaningful control over significant portions of the Black Sea. Not through warships, through drones, missiles, intelligence, and the willingness to innovate faster than the enemy can adapt. Russia built its Black Sea strategy on two pillars: a surface fleet and coastal defense missiles. Ukraine has systematically destroyed both. The fleet is hiding. The bastions are burning, and every day that passes, the Black Sea becomes less of a Russian lake and more of a contested space where Ukrainian ingenuity holds the advantage. Now, the answer to our earlier question: how many Russian air defense assets were diverted by the Ukrainian decoy swarm? The answer is C, 6 or more systems. Ukrainian intelligence confirmed that in addition to the Pantsir S-1 and Buk M3 batteries that were directly diverted, at least 4 additional radar stations and air defense observation posts along the northeastern Crimean coastline were alerted and oriented toward the decoy swarm. This pulled attention, communications bandwidth, and command focus away from the western approach corridor during the critical 4-minute window that the strike munitions needed to reach their targets. 17 cheap drones occupied the attention of 6 or more air defense systems. The cost of those decoys was roughly equivalent to a single Panzer missile. That is the kind of math that wins wars. 3 questions for you. Was the timing of the strike, during the maintenance window with the Monolith B radar powered down, the only viable approach, or could Ukraine have struck the battery during transit between positions? Could Russia have prevented this loss by varying the Bastion battery's rotation pattern more aggressively? Or was the logistical requirement for maintenance at a fixed depot an unavoidable vulnerability? What would you have done differently if you were the Ukrainian strike planner? Would you have waited for a moment when 2 Bastion batteries were co-located, accepting higher risk for a greater payoff? Drop your answers in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe to Warfist TV, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Real tactics, real consequences. Warfist TV. Crimea's western shore is quiet now. The staging area has been bulldozed, the craters filled, the wreckage hauled away by Russian recovery teams working under camouflage netting, nervous about the sky. But satellite imagery still shows the scorch marks, the blackened earth, where $100 million of Russian coastal defense burned in 90 seconds. And somewhere in southern Ukraine, a drone operator is studying the next rotation pattern, tracking the next target, waiting for the next window. The Black Sea is no longer Russia's to control, and every bastion that burns makes that truth harder to deny. Stay vigilant.